mountains had swallowed the sun whole, and long, skeletal shadows clawed their way across the asphalt. My cruiser's headlights knifed through a fog so dense it felt like piloting a submarine through wet cotton. The winding mountain roads, a serpent spine of asphalt, twisted and turned, each curve unveiling another wall of towering pines, ancient guardians pressing in on either side. This backwater assignment, Black Hollow, was my penance after the Pittsburgh shooting. I'd choose boredom over bloodshed any day of the week. Black Hollow announced itself with a weathered sign, older than sin itself. Population 150, welcome. The paint peeled like diseased skin, and some local wit had scratched out the 5 with deliberate precision, replacing it with a 0. A dark joke, or maybe just brutal honesty. Pines loomed like sentinels on both sides of the road, their branches reaching across the narrow passage like arthritic fingers, desperate to drag unwary travelers into their cold embrace. The fog was a shroud, clinging to the valley, turning familiar shapes into hulking phantoms that danced at the edge of the headlights. I pulled into Teague's Gas and Go, a sagging shack that looked ready to collapse at the slightest provocation. The single flickering pump stood like a dying soldier, its numbers frozen at prices from a decade lost to time. The building's siding was gray with age and neglect, held together by rust, prayer, and maybe just sheer stubbornness. A neon sign buzzed in the grimy window, open, though it flickered between sickly red and complete darkness, a visual onomatopoeia for the town's pulse. Old Man Teague emerged from the shadows within, moving with the careful shuffle of someone whose bones had surrendered the fight against gravity long ago. His eyes were sunken deep in a face carved from driftwood, weathered and worn by decades of mountain torment. His hands, gnarled as tree roots and spotted with age, trembled slightly as he handed me a styrofoam cup that had seen better decades. New Deputy Mills? His voice was gravel on broken glass, roughened by years of unfiltered cigarettes and mountain air. The coffee smelled burnt, like it had been stewing on the burner since dawn broke. He continued, just remember, lights out by 10 p.m. ain't no law past that hour, but the land's got its own. I took a sip and winced. The coffee tasted like charcoal mixed with regret and a faint whisper of what might once have been beans. Superstitions bad for tourism, old-timer? Teague's grin revealed gaps where teeth should have been, and the few survivors were yellow as old corn kernels. He slapped his knee with genuine amusement, the sound echoing in the empty station like a gunshot. Tourism, he cackled, wiping tears from his rheumy eyes. That's a good one, Deputy Mills. Real good. You'll learn different soon enough. They all do. The bell above the door chimed like a funeral dirge as I left, its brass surface tarnished black with age. The sound echoed through the empty street, bouncing off boarded windows and abandoned storefronts that stood like broken teeth in a skull's grin. This place felt like a graveyard that had forgotten it was supposed to be quiet. The sheriff's station sat on Main Street like a tired old dog, too weary to move but too stubborn to die. The white paint peeled in long strips that curled in the mountain wind, revealing gray wood underneath, seasoned by decades of harsh weather. The building sagged in the middle like a swayback horse, and the front steps were worn smooth by generations of boots, some belonging to lawmen, others to the lawless. Sheriff Dan Dutton was waiting inside, a grizzled man in his 60s whose face told stories of too many hard winters and harder decisions. His eyes held depths that spoke of things seen and unseen, witnessed and ignored. The station felt smaller in the growing darkness, its walls pressing in like the mountains outside. A shotgun leaned against the door frame, its barrel etched with 3 parallel marks that looked too deliberate to be accidental. Mills. Dutton's voice carried the weight of authority earned through blood and time. He handed me a rusted key that felt heavier than physics should allow, its metal warm despite the growing cold. The air tasted of damp earth and secrets buried deep. One rule here: be indoors by 10 p.m. Not 9:59, not 10:01, 10 o'clock. Break it, and you won't live to regret it. I gripped my badge, feeling its familiar weight against my palm. What happens at 10? Nothing good. Dutton's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter, something that left a taste he couldn't spit out. His eyes flicked to the window, then back to me with the intensity of a man who'd seen too much. Your cabin's up on Pine Ridge. Keep your radio on. Always. That first night, I sat in my assigned cabin, nursing a beer that tasted flat and trying to make sense of the warnings. The walls were thin as paper, and every sound from the forest seemed amplified. Branches scraping against the tin roof like skeletal fingers, wind whistling through gaps in the siding with voices that almost sounded human, the distant hoot of an owl that seemed to echo with unnatural resonance. Around midnight, sleep was finally dragging me under when I heard scraping on my door, long deliberate gouges that made my teeth ache and my spine crawl with primitive fear. The sound was methodical, patient, like something was carving its signature into the wood with surgical precision. I grabbed my service pistol and crept to the window, but the porch light revealed nothing except dancing shadows and fog thick as grave dirt. When dawn came, pale and reluctant through the pine branches, I found 3 deep scratches in the door, each gouge 6 inches long and exactly 1 inch deep, carved with impossible precision. The wood around the marks was blackened, as if something colder than winter had burned it with its touch. The next evening brought my first real patrol and, with it, my introduction to Black Hollow's nightly transformation. At 9:30, I cruised Hollow Road at 9:30. I watched the town morph, like some living creature preparing for a hibernation far darker than any winter sleep. Porch lights blinked out, each extinguished bulb a tiny defeat surrendered to the encroaching night. Doors slammed shut, sharp reports that echoed off the mountains with an unnatural clarity, like gunshots in the stillness. Even the crickets went silent, leaving only the whisper of wind sighing through the pine needles and the low thrum of my cruiser's engine. A mother, her face etched with a fear that seemed to seep from her very bones, dragged her child inside their trailer with desperate haste. The boy dropped his toy truck, its bright red paint suddenly garish, like fresh blood under the street light. But she didn't stop, didn't even glance back. Her eyes met mine through the windshield, and I saw it there. The look of someone who knew exactly what was coming and had made whatever peace they could with it. This wasn't Pittsburgh, where fear had faces, names, and could be processed and cuffed. This was older, something that had been here before the town, and would remain long after it crumbled back into the mountain soil. The hollow in neon sign buzzed weakly, casting a sickly pink glow on the empty street. Half the letters had surrendered their ghost years ago. Fog, thick as a shroud, swallowed everything beyond the halo of the street lamps, turning familiar buildings into hulking shadows that seemed to shift and breathe with a malevolent life of their own. I checked my watch. 9:45. My radio crackled with static, a sound almost like whispers, voices just beyond the reach of human hearing. I turned up the volume, but there was nothing except the electronic hiss of empty air and the growing certainty that something was listening. At 9:55, Mitch Brewer stumbled out of the tavern, laughing with the false courage that came from finding the bottom of several bottles and deciding to befriend them. He was a harmless enough drunk during daylight, when the worst he could do was fall asleep in a ditch. But tonight, something was different in his bloodshot eyes, a reckless defiance that made my trained instincts scream warnings. "Y'all scared of the dark, Deputy Mills?" Mitch slurred, pointing a wavering finger at me like a broken compass needle. Spit flew from his lips as he spoke, and his breath fogged in the sudden cold. "I ain't. Just gonna piss in the alley, then maybe take a walk. Fresh mountain air, you know? Ain't no law against walking, is there? Get inside, Brewer." I called through my window, letting every ounce of authority I'd learned on Pittsburgh streets color my voice. "It's 2 minutes to 10. Mitch waved me off with a gesture that was both dismissive and obscene. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, midnight, what's the difference? Ain't nothing out here but trees and clean mountain air. You'll been listening to too many ghost stories." He staggered into the narrow alley between the tavern and Howell's Hardware, his drunken laughter echoing off the brick walls like the sound of shattering glass. I parked and followed, my flashlight beam dancing across brick walls slick with condensation and dumpsters that reeked of rotting food and something else, something that reminded me of open graves. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, and the walls seemed to press in from both sides like the throat of some massive beast. Water dripped from fire escapes with the relentless rhythm of a funeral march. "Brewer, get your ass out here," I called. My voice sounded small and fragile in the confined space, swallowed by fog and the weight of approaching midnight. "It's past 10. The laughter stopped as if a switch had been flipped. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no dripping, no distant hum of electricity, just the frantic hammering of my heart and the sound of my own breathing, harsh and loud in the sudden stillness. I swept the flashlight beam back and forth, illuminating nothing but empty air and the growing stench of decay. At 10:03, I found Mitch's left boot standing upright in the alley like a monument to poor decision-making. It was filled to the brim with black pine needles, damp and cold as winter earth, their surfaces slick with something that might have been dew, or might have been something far worse. The needles had an oily quality that made them cling to my fingers when I tried to brush them away. A wet, coppery stench hung in the air, so thick I could taste it coating my tongue like blood. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a shadow that flowed like oil between the buildings, too fluid to be human, too purposeful to be natural. When I spun toward it, my flashlight beam found nothing but brick and metal and the lingering smell of opened graves. But I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness beyond the light's reach, patient and hungry and utterly inhuman. "No animal did this," I muttered, bagging the boot with hands that refused to stop shaking. "Not with those needles. Not standing up like that." Back at the station, Sheriff Dan Dutton logged Mitch's disappearance as an animal attack without looking up from his paperwork. His pen scratched across the forms with mechanical precision, but I noticed the slight tremor in his weathered hands as he wrote. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects, casting harsh shadows that made the office feel smaller than it was. I noticed fresh claw marks on the evidence room door, 3 parallel gouges, each exactly 6 inches long and 1 inch deep. The wood around them was scorched black, as if something impossibly cold had burned its signature into the grain. The same pattern as my cabin door, the same surgical precision that spoke of intelligence and deliberate intent. "Don't ask," Dan Dutton said when he caught me. Staring, Dan Dutton's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Yet his eyes betrayed a profound exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of repeating the same grim tales to deputies asking the same damn questions. "Just be thankful you didn't see what took him." He opened his desk drawer and produced a bottle of whiskey, the expensive stuff that cost more than I made in a week. Without so much as a glance to see if I wanted any, he poured 2 glasses, the amber liquid shimmering like trapped fire in the stark light. "Something's been here longer than this town, longer than these mountains. Something that understands the rules better than we do." The whiskey burned as it went down, a familiar, human burn that grounded me to reality in a world that seemed hell-bent on abandoning it. "Rules?" I asked. "One rule," Dan Dutton corrected, sliding the bottle across the desk. "Don't go out after 10. He gestured wearily towards the evidence room door and its trio of scars, the gesture holding the resignation of a man who'd had this conversation far too many times. Later, hunched over the station's ancient security monitor, I found something that turned my blood to ice water. At 10:02, a 7-foot shadow paused under the streetlight outside the tavern. For less than 3 seconds, amber eyes glowed in the darkness like twin stars, staring directly at the camera with an intelligence that was anything but animal. The figure was wrong in a way that physically hurt to perceive. Too tall, too thin, its proportions all out of whack like a puzzle assembled by a madman. Its head was tilted at an angle that would have snapped a human neck, and its silhouette hinted at limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't, joints moving with predatory grace through impossible angles. Then it was gone, vanishing into the fog as if it had never existed. The stench of copper and decay burned my throat as I rewound the tape, watching the same impossible moment over and over until my eyes watered. The station's temperature had plummeted at least 20 degrees since I'd started watching, my breath now visible in the frigid air despite the heating system running at full blast. This wasn't a bear or a mountain lion, or any other natural predator. This was something else entirely, something that left black pine needles in abandoned boots and hunted by the clock with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. something that understood rules in ways that made my skin crawl with primitive recognition. I locked the station with hands that trembled despite my best efforts and drove home through streets as empty as a plague town. Fog pressed against my windshield like grasping fingers, thick enough to muffle sound and turn familiar landmarks into alien shapes. The radio crackled with static, and for a split second, I thought I heard Deputy Mills' voice calling for help from somewhere impossibly far away. But Deputy Mills was gone, leaving behind only his boot, the memory of amber eyes watching from the dark, and the growing certainty that in Black Hollow, I was no longer the hunter. I was the prey, and something ancient and patient was teaching me the rules of a game I was already losing. 3 days had passed since Deputy Mills vanished, and the boots sat in the evidence room like an accusation. Black pine needles still clung to my fingers despite scrubbing them raw. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those amber lights staring back from the security footage, patient and hungry. The diner on Main Street looked like it had been built during the Depression and forgotten ever since. Cracked vinyl booths, fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying insects, and coffee that could strip paint. I was nursing my second cup when Lena Ruiz walked in. Lena Ruiz moved with the careful grace of someone who'd learned not to show weakness. Dark hair pulled back, work-worn hands, and eyes that held storms. She slid into the booth across from me without invitation, spreading missing person flyers across the scratched Formica table like tarot cards, revealing a grim future. "You're the new deputy." Her voice heavy with the distrust of someone who'd learned not to trust badges. "I'm Lena. I tend bar at the Hollow Inn." I studied the faces staring up from the photocopied papers. Men, women, teenagers, all with the same haunted eyes that seemed to follow me. Lot of missing people for a town this size. All went missing after 10 p.m. She tapped one flyer with a chipped fingernail. "This one's my brother, Ben." Ben Ruiz had Lena's eyes but softer features. The face of someone who'd never learned to expect the worst from the world. 26 years old. Last seen 2 weeks ago near the church on Hollow Road. Below his photo, someone had written reward. No questions asked, in desperate block letters. Ben's jacket was found on Hollow Road. Lena's voice cracked like old leather. Smelled like wet earth and rotten meat. Dan Dutton called it a bear. I pocketed the flyer, noting the pattern. Every disappearance happened after 10 p.m. just like Deputy Mills, just like the rule demanded. Bears don't leave jackets behind or tell people to hide by 10. "You believe me?" Surprise flickered across her features like lightning behind clouds. "I've seen things in 3 days that would make a Pittsburgh cop run screaming." I met her eyes, seeing desperation there that mirrored my own guilt. "What do you think happened to him?" Something that knows his voice. Lena's fingers traced Ben's photo with the tenderness of someone touching a gravestone. Mrs. Henderson heard him calling for help from the woods last Tuesday, but Ben was already gone by then. The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. Voice mimicry. The Night Stalker's calling card, according to the pattern I was starting to piece together. What time did she hear the voice? 10:30. Lena's jaw tightened. She was smart enough to stay inside that night. Deputy Mills patrolled Hollow Road with a newfound purpose. The familiar transformation commenced around 9:30 p.m. Porch lights blinked out, doors slammed shut, the town tucking itself in, a child hiding beneath its blankets. But tonight possessed a different feel. The fog seemed denser, pressing against the cruiser's windshield with a deliberate, weighty presence. 10:15, Deputy Mills heard it. "Help me, Deputy." Ben Ruiz's voice, clear as church bells, echoing from the woods near the old Baptist church. The abandoned building sat at the edge of town, its white paint peeling like diseased skin, weeds strangling the graveyard, and the steeple leaning precariously, a broken finger pointing accusations at the heavens. Deputy Mills knew it was a trap. Every instinct screamed warnings. Every lesson learned in Pittsburgh urged a call for backup and a wait until daylight. But if it was Ben, if somehow he'd survived these past 2 weeks, Pittsburgh had taught Deputy Mills not to hesitate again. The last time Deputy Mills waited, Maria Santos died with Deputy Mills's bullet in her chest instead of the gun she'd been reaching for. The memory tasted like copper and regret. Deputy Mills parked the cruiser and stepped onto the church's rotting porch. The temperature plummeted instantly, dropping 20 degrees, Deputy Mills's breath fogging in the sudden cold. Pine needles whispered overhead, but there was no wind. "Ben," Deputy Mills called. Deputy Mills's voice sounding small in the oppressive darkness. "Ben Ruiz, down here in the basement." The voice emanated from beneath the church, muffled by old wood and stone. It sounded exactly like the desperate hope Deputy Mills had heard in Lena Ruiz's description of her brother. The fog thickened around Deputy Mills, heavy as wet wool. It moved with purpose, flowing like liquid smoke between the pine trees. Deputy Mills's flashlight beam barely penetrated the gray wall, transforming the familiar woods into alien territory. A low growl vibrated in Deputy Mills's molars like a drill boring into bone. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the very ground beneath Deputy Mills's feet. Every muscle in Deputy Mills's body tensed, prey instincts overriding years of police training. Deputy Mills followed the voice deeper into the woods, the flashlight beam dancing across tombstones that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. The beam caught something hanging from an ancient oak tree 50 yards from the church, something that made Deputy Mills's stomach lurch with a sickening mixture of recognition and revulsion. A deer carcass hung upside down, its ribs cracked outward like the pages of an opened book. The creature had been gutted with surgical precision, its organs removed and arranged in disturbing patterns around the tree's base, patterns that hurt to look at. 3 parallel claw marks gouged the oak's trunk, each 6 inches long and exactly 1 inch deep. The Night Stalker's signature, carved into living wood. The stench of open graves hit Deputy Mills like a physical blow, so thick Deputy Mills could taste decay coating Deputy Mills's tongue. Blood, still wet despite the cold, dripped from the carcass with the relentless persistence of a funeral march. This wasn't an animal kill. This was a message. "Deputy," Ben Ruiz's voice called again, closer now. "I'm scared." But the voice came from directly beneath the hanging deer, and there was nothing there but shadows and blood-soaked earth. The mimicry was perfect, every inflection, every note of fear that would send Lena Ruiz running into the darkness without thought or hesitation. Deputy Mills drew Deputy Mills's service pistol, the familiar weight grounding Deputy Mills in reality. The metal felt ice-cold against Deputy Mills's palm, and Deputy Mills's breath came in sharp puffs that disappeared into the unnatural fog. Something moved in Deputy Mills's peripheral vision, a shadow that flowed like oil between the tombstones. Then Deputy Mills felt it. Something brushed the back of Deputy Mills's neck, cold as grave soil and just as final, fingers that weren't quite fingers, with joints that bent in directions that violated anatomy. The touch lasted less than a second, but it burned like frostbite, leaving numbness that spread down Deputy Mills's spine like spilled ice water. Deputy Mills spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through empty air. Nothing but fog and silence and the lingering scent of wet earth and rotting meat. But Deputy Mills could feel eyes watching from the darkness beyond Deputy Mills's light's reach, patient and hungry and utterly inhuman. Deputy Mills ran. 20 years of police training, military service, and urban streets meant nothing in that moment. Deputy Mills ran like a child fleeing monsters under the bed, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over hidden roots. Branches clawed at Deputy Mills's uniform, and fog seemed to pursue Deputy Mills with deliberate malice. Deputy Mills's cabin appeared through the gray wall like salvation, its porch light a beacon in the consuming darkness. Deputy Mills slammed the door behind Deputy Mills, through every lock, then barricaded it with Deputy Mills's kitchen table. Deputy Mills's hand shook as Deputy Mills grabbed the radio, but static was the only response. Electronic snow that sounded almost like whispers in a language Deputy Mills didn't want to understand. The rest of the night, Deputy Mills sat in Deputy Mills's chair with the shotgun across Deputy Mills's knees, watching the windows and listening for scratching that never came. The fog pressed against the glass like seeking fingers, and shapes moved within it that might have been trees or might have been something else entirely. Dawn came late and reluctant, filtering through the dissipating mist with gray light that revealed the night's toll. 3 fresh scratches marked Deputy Mills's cabin door, each exactly 6 inches long and 1 inch deep. But these were different from the first night's marks. These bled a dark, sap-like fluid that stained the wood black and smelled of copper pennies and turned earth. Deputy Mills touched the wounds with trembling fingers, and the fluid was warm despite the morning cold. The Night Stalker had marked Deputy Mills personally now, claimed Deputy Mills as surely as it had claimed Mitch and Ben Ruiz and all the others who'd broken the rule. As Deputy Mills stood there in the pale morning light, studying the proof of Deputy Mills's violation, Deputy Mills understood what Sheriff Dan Dutton had been trying to tell Deputy Mills. The rule wasn't just a superstition or local custom. It was a contract written in blood and enforced by something that had been hungry long before Black Hollow. Deputy Mills had broken the rule, and now Deputy Mills belonged to whatever lived in the darkness between the trees. The only question was how long Deputy Mills had before it came to collect. The radio crackled to life with Sheriff Dan Dutton's voice. "Deputy Mills, you copy? Got another missing person report. Tourist named Williams, car found on Hollow Road. You see anything last night?" Deputy Mills stared at the bleeding scratches on Deputy Mills's door and keyed the radio with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Nothing, Sheriff. Quiet night." But Deputy Mills could still feel the cold touch on Deputy Mills's neck, and Deputy Mills knew Deputy Mills's quiet nights in Black Hollow were over. The bleeding stopped by noon, but the scratches remained. 3 parallel wounds weeping dark sap that stained Deputy Mills's cabin door like old blood. Deputy Mills had scrubbed them with bleach, carved around the edges with Deputy Mills's knife, even tried sanding the wood smooth. Nothing worked. The marks went deeper than timber. Lena Ruiz found Deputy Mills there at sunset, staring at the evidence of Deputy Mills's second violation. Her dark eyes fixed on the wounds in the wood, and Deputy Mills watched her face go pale as winter bone. "It marked you." Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen this before. "Just like it marked Ben Ruiz's door the night before he disappeared." Deputy Mills touched the scratches, feeling warmth pulse beneath the surface like a slow heartbeat. "How long do I have?" Ben Ruiz lasted 3 days after his second marking. She pulled a flask from her jacket, hands trembling. "3 times the last time, Deputy Mills. Always." They sat on Deputy Mills's porch steps as darkness gathered, sharing whiskey that burned like liquid courage. Lena Ruiz clutched Ben Ruiz's jacket, heavy canvas that still held his scent beneath the corruption of wet earth and decay. "Sheriff Dan Dutton won't help," she said, watching fog begin its nightly crawl up from the valley. "Been asking him for 2 weeks. He just keeps writing animal attack in that damn ledger. Dan Dutton knows more than he's saying." Deputy Mills handed back the flask. "But he's protecting something. Protecting the thing that took Deputy Mills's brother." Lena Ruiz's voice cracked with rage. "Maybe he's protecting the town. Maybe he's protecting what's left of it." Lena Ruiz stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch where shadows gathered like hungry ghosts. "I don't care about the town. I care about Ben Ruiz, and if you won't help me find him, I'll do it myself." Lena Ruiz, wait. Deputy Mills grabbed her arm. "You go out there alone, you'll end up just like him." She turned, and Deputy Mills saw something in her eyes that made Deputy Mills's blood run cold. The look of someone who'd already accepted their fate. Maybe that's what it takes. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Their breath suddenly fogged, and the whiskey flask grew so cold it burned Lena Ruiz's fingers. She dropped it, and the metal rang against the porch boards like a funeral bell. Something moved in the treeline beyond Deputy Mills's cabin. Amber light flickered in the darkness, paired eyes that watched them with the patience of a predator that had all the time in the world. "It's here," Lena Ruiz whispered. "It knows we're talking about it." By the next evening, Lena Ruiz had worn Deputy Mills down with her relentless logic and bottomless desperation. They sat in Deputy Mills's cruiser on Hollow Road at 9:45 p.m., watching the town perform its nightly ritual of surrender. Porch lights died like falling stars, doors slammed with the finality of coffin lids, and Lena Ruiz clutched Ben Ruiz's jacket like a shield. "He's out there somewhere. I can feel him." Deputy Mills loaded Deputy Mills's shotgun with hands that refused to stop shaking. "What if it's not him? What if it's just the thing that took him?" Then we kill it. Her smile was sharp as broken glass. Or it kills us. The fog began its nightly rise, thick tendrils crawling up the mountainside like searching fingers. Street lamps became isolated islands of yellow light in a gray ocean. 10:15, they heard it. Lena Ruiz. Lena Ruiz, help me. Ben Ruiz's voice, clear and desperate, calling from the woods beyond the abandoned church. Lena Ruiz's sharp intake of breath told Deputy Mills she heard it too, recognized the voice that had called her name since childhood. That's him. She fumbled for the door handle. That's Ben Ruiz. He's alive. Deputy Mills grabbed her wrist. It's a trap, Lena Ruiz. You know it's a trap. I don't care. She yanked free. I'm not leaving him out there. The voice called again, closer now. Lena Ruiz, please. It's coming back. She bolted from the car before Deputy Mills could stop her, running toward the sound with desperate speed. Deputy Mills cursed and followed. Deputy Mills's flashlight beam dancing wildly across fog so thick it seemed solid. Ben Ruiz, where are you? Lena Ruiz crashed through underbrush, thorns catching at her clothes. Blood ran from scratches on her cheeks. At 10:30, amber eyes ignited in the woods ahead like twin stars being born. The fog swirled Rahul, revealing glimpses of something that shouldn't exist. 7 feet of shadow given form, limbs that bent at impossible angles. The Night Stalker unfolded from the darkness like a nightmare learning to walk, its jaw unhinged vertically, revealing rows of serrated bone ridges. The sound that emerged was part growl, part scream, part something that vibrated in Deputy Mills's molars like a dentist's drill. It smelled of wet soil after rain and meat left too long in summer heat. The stench hit them like a physical blow, so overwhelming Deputy Mills tasted copper and bile. Lena Ruiz, I'm scared. The thing spoke with Ben Ruiz's voice, words emerging from that unhinged mouth with perfect pitch. Don't let it hurt me. Lena Ruiz bolted toward the voice despite everything. The impossible anatomy, the stench of death, the wrongness that radiated from the creature like heat from a furnace. Love made her stupid, made her deaf to warning. Deputy Mills tackled her at full speed, driving them both into the wet earth as claws whistled through the air where her head had been. The talons shredded her jacket. Blood bloomed from the shallow cuts. Run! Deputy Mills yelled, hauling Lena Ruiz to her feet. Don't look back. The Night Stalker gave chase, moving with an unnatural grace, its immense form somehow fluid and swift. Its claws scraped against the tombstones, showering sparks that hissed like agitated serpents. Each footfall resonated through the ground, a primal rhythm that vibrated in our very bones. They reached Deputy Mills's cruiser just as something seized the rear bumper, the metal screaming in protest as it was wrenched. Deputy Mills floored the accelerator, tires shrieking against the asphalt as they made their escape. In the rearview mirror, those amber eyes watched them recede, perhaps with a hint of amusement. The scratches on Lena Ruiz's arm refused to stop bleeding. 3 parallel wounds, each an exact 6 inches long and 1 inch deep, weeping steadily despite the pressure and the bandages. They burned like frostbite, she said, a cold fire that crept up her arm. Sheriff Dan Dutton was waiting at the station, a bottle of expensive whiskey already uncorked on his desk. His weathered face bore the weary resignation of a man who'd already had this discussion too many times. Drink. He poured 3 glasses without a word. You'll need it for what I'm about to tell you. Lena Ruiz cradled her bandaged arm against her chest. What is that thing? What happened to my brother, Ben Ruiz? Sheriff Dan Dutton's hands trembled as he raised his glass. It's been here longer than the town itself, longer than any of us. My grandfather called it the Keeper, said it was here when the Cherokee still hunted these valleys. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a human fire, a familiar pain that tethered them to reality. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, and something shifted within that gray, swirling wall. We tried everything, Sheriff Dan Dutton continued. Fire, bullets, preachers with holy water. Hell, we even brought in federal boys back in '89, ATF agents with enough firepower to level a city block. He produced a faded photograph, Men in tactical gear standing around what appeared to be a crater in the forest floor, smoke still curling from the scorched earth. They hid it with white phosphorus, thermite, enough explosives to bring down a building. The thing just walked out of the flames like they were a spring shower. Sheriff Dan Dutton's finger traced the image. 2 of them never left these mountains. The others went home and ate their guns. Lena Ruiz leaned forward. There has to be a way to kill it. Can't kill something that was never alive, Sheriff Dan Dutton said, refilling their glasses. Best we can do is manage it. Feed it what it wants when it wants it, and maybe it leaves the rest of us alone. The words struck Deputy Mills like a splash of ice water. Feed it? You're talking about sacrifice. I'm talking about survival. Sheriff Dan Dutton's eyes held fathomless depths of exhaustion. Mitch broke the rule. Ben Ruiz broke the rule. Anyone stupid enough to be outside after 10 p.m. breaks the rule. They make their choice. He opened his desk drawer and withdrew a manila folder, thick with yellowed papers. Newspaper clippings and official reports stretching back decades. Missing persons, unexplained deaths, animal attacks, all following the same grim pattern. Every 70 years, it gets hungry for more than just rule breakers, Sheriff Dan Dutton said, spreading the papers across his desk. Takes whole families sometimes. Burns through the town like wildfire until we give it what it really wants. Which is? Deputy Mills's voice was barely a whisper. A keeper of its own. Someone to enforce the rule, to make sure it gets fed regular-like. Sheriff Dan Dutton slid the shotgun across the desk toward Deputy Mills, its barrel etched with those familiar 3 parallel marks. Your turn to choose, Deputy Mills. Enforce the rule and keep the peace, or break it again and join the others. The weapon felt heavier than it should, laden with implied threat and a terrible choice. Outside, something howled in the distance, a sound that was not quite wolf, not quite human. The sound made the windows vibrate and sent ice water through Deputy Mills's veins. Lena Ruiz stared at Deputy Mills across the desk, her bandaged arm cradled against her chest. You can't be serious, she said. I'm asking him to save this town. Sheriff Dan Dutton's voice carried decades of authority, but beneath it was a tremor of sleepless fear. To save what's left of it. Because come next feeding time, if we don't have a keeper, that thing's going to take everyone. The choice hung between them like a loaded gun, heavy with consequence and future sins. Deputy Mills could feel the scratches on his cabin door pulsing like a heartbeat, marking time until his 3rd violation. Deputy Mills could taste copper in the air, smell the wet earth stench that clung to the Night Stalker. In the distance, those amber eyes flickered between the trees, patient and hungry and utterly inhuman. Whatever Deputy Mills chose, he was no longer just Deputy Mills. He was prey or predator or something caught between. The clock ticked toward midnight with mechanical indifference, each second drawing him closer to a decision that would define not just his fate, but the fate of everyone in Black Hollow. The choice haunted Deputy Mills for 3 sleepless nights. Sheriff Dan Dutton's ultimatum echoed in his skull like a broken record. Enforce the rule or be next. Deputy Mills sat in his cabin, staring at the bleeding scratches on his door, feeling the weight of the shotgun across his knees. The sap had stopped flowing, but the marks remained, 3 parallel wounds that pulsed with their own dark rhythm. Lena Ruiz hadn't spoken to Deputy Mills since that night at the station. Her arm was healing, but the scratches left scars that looked like tiny brands. She'd taken to closing the tavern early, locking herself inside before 9 p.m. Smart woman. Smarter than Deputy Mills. The radio crackled with static as Deputy Mills sat in his cruiser on Hollow Road, watching the nightly transformation begin. At 9:30 p.m., the familiar ritual. Porch lights dying like falling stars, doors slamming with the finality of coffin lids, curtains drawing tight against windows. The town tucked itself in like a child hiding under blankets, waiting for the monster to pass 9:55 p.m. And then I saw them. Headlights. A silver Mercedes sedan, its engine sounding like a death rattle, limped down the mountain road. Ghostly tendrils of steam billowed from beneath the hood, and even through the windshield, I could see the driver's mounting frustration. The car shuddered to a halt 50 yards from the tavern, hazard lights blinking like desperate signals. The driver, a man in his 40s, emerged, his expensive suit practically screaming city money. Leather shoes, a gold watch, and a palpable wave of panic washed over him as he saw the steam pouring from his engine. He threw open the hood, cursing loud enough for his words to echo against the mountainside. I glanced at my watch. 9:58 p.m. The tourist's voice carried across the deserted street. He brandished his phone at the sky, a pathetic attempt at finding a signal. No signal. Of course, there's no signal. I drove over slowly, my headlights illuminating his increasingly desperate face. He was soft around the edges, the kind of man who'd never missed a meal or worried about anything more threatening than a plummeting stock portfolio. His name was probably Williams. We'd gotten a missing person report that morning about a tourist whose car was found abandoned. Evening, I said, rolling down my window. Car trouble. Thank God. He rushed towards my cruiser, relief flooding his features. I'm David Williams. My radiator's blown to hell, and I can't get a signal on my phone. Is there a mechanic in town? A tow truck? I checked my watch again. 9:59 p.m. Get in my cruiser, Mr. Williams. Now. What? No, I can't leave my car. It's a Mercedes. Do you know how much this thing cost? He gestured at the steaming vehicle as if it were a wounded animal. Just help me push it somewhere safe, and I'll call AAA in the morning. At 10 p.m., the street lamps flickered like dying candles. The fog began its nightly ascent from the valley floor, thick tendrils creeping up the mountainside with a deliberate, hungry pace. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in seconds, and our breath became suddenly visible in the frigid air. Sir, you need to get in this cruiser right now. My hand instinctively moved to the shotgun mounted between the seats. It's not safe to be outside. Not safe. Williams laughed, the sound sharp and brittle as breaking glass. What's going to happen, officer? Am I going to get a parking ticket? This is America, not Afghanistan. The fog thickened around us, heavy as wet wool. The street lamps became isolated islands of sickly yellow light in a gray, swirling ocean. Something moved in the tree line beyond the tavern, a shadow that seemed to flow like oil between the pines. Last chance, Williams. I gripped the shotgun, my knuckles white against the weapon's stock. Get in the car. I'm not abandoning a $60,000 vehicle because some backwoods cop is afraid of the dark. He turned back to his Mercedes, popping the trunk. I'll push it myself if I have to. At 10:02 p.m., I put the cruiser in drive and pulled away slowly, watching Williams in my rearview mirror. He was bent over the trunk, presumably searching for a toolbox or emergency kit. The fog swirled around him like hungry ghosts, and amber eyes flickered in the darkness beyond the street lamps. Better him than a family? I whispered, the words tasting like ash and copper on my tongue. Better him than me. The Night Stalker materialized from the shadows, a nightmare given form. 7 feet of wrong angles and impossible geometry. It moved with a predatory grace toward the man who'd broken the rule. Williams looked up from his trunk just as the creature's jaw unhinged vertically, revealing rows of serrated bone ridges. His scream sliced through the night, high and desperate and utterly human. Then it stopped mid-echo, swallowed by the fog and the wet, sickening sound of things tearing apart. I didn't look back. I drove home through the empty streets, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and locked my cabin door behind me. The next morning, they found Williams's Mercedes on Hollow Road, doors open, engine still warm. No body, no blood, just black pine needles scattered across the leather seats and 3 parallel claw marks gouged into the driver's side door. Sheriff Dan Dutton logged it as an animal attack and filed the paperwork with the same mechanical precision he'd used for Mitch and Ben and all the others. He handed me the keys to the sheriff's office that afternoon, his weathered face holding the relief of a man passing a terrible burden to younger shoulders. It's your town now, Carter, he said, packing his few belongings into a cardboard box. Your rule to enforce, your choice to make every night. The brass star felt heavier than it should when he pinned it to my chest. Sheriff Eli Carter. The title carried weight that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with complicity. 1 year later, the October night was cold enough to see breath, and fog clung to the valley like a familiar shroud. I sat in my cruiser on Main Street, watching the town perform its ritual of surrender. Porch lights died in sequence, doors slammed with practiced timing, and Black Hollow tucked itself away from the darkness that owned the hours after 10 o'clock. At 10:04 p.m., I spotted him. A teenager, maybe 17, leaning against the tavern's brick wall with a cigarette glowing between his fingers. He wore torn jeans and a leather jacket that had seen better decades, and his hair fell across his eyes in that way that made adults want to tell him to get a haircut. He looked exactly like I had at his age. Angry, defiant, and convinced he was immortal. The street lights flickered as fog began its nightly crawl up from the valley. The woods exhaled a frosty breath, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the tree-line, amber eyes ignited like twin stars. The Night Stalker was patient, but it was also punctual. My radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, Sheriff." Deputy Mills' voice crackled through the radio, a blend of concern and youthful naivete. "Carter, this is Deputy Mills. Shouldn't we warn that kid? He's been out there for 5 minutes." Mills was a fresh face, barely 3 months into the job, still clinging to the ideals of heroes and happy resolutions, still believing the badge represented something more than maintaining order through calculated losses. He'd either adapt or leave. They always did, eventually. I reached for the radio, my gaze fixed on the teenager taking another defiant puff from his cigarette. The boy was making his choice just as Mitch had, just like Ben Ruiz and Williams and all the others who'd thought they were too invincible or too clever or too exceptional for the rules that kept Black Hollow alive. "Negative, Deputy," I responded, my voice even despite the heavy feeling in my chest. "Let him be." "But Sheriff, he'll learn." The words escaped me, sharper than intended, carrying the weight of someone who'd come to terms with necessary evils. Or he won't. Either way, it's his choice. I extinguished my porch light, the signal that signified non-intervention. Darkness surged in to occupy the void where light had been, and the fog enveloped the teenager like grasping appendages. He glanced up at the lifeless bulb, a flicker of confusion crossing his youthful features, yet he remained rooted, defiant to the bitter end. At precisely 10:07, the screaming commenced. It lasted exactly 37 seconds. I counted, each one marking time like a metronome keeping rhythm with someone else's demise. The sound ceased abruptly, consumed by the fog and the sickening noises of things that belonged buried. When dawn arrived, they'd discover his jacket suspended from a tree branch, filled with black pine needles and the lingering scent of damp earth. I drove back to the station through streets as deserted as a graveyard, the radio silence save for the intermittent bursts of static that almost sounded like whispers. The fog pressed against my windshield like grasping hands, and shapes shifted within it that could have been trees or something else entirely. The brass nameplate on my desk read, "Sheriff E. Carter," in letters that gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights. I'd had it made 6 months prior when I'd finally acknowledged what I'd become. Not a protector, not a servant of justice, but a guardian of rules written in blood and enforced by something that had been hungry long before Black Hollow existed. Amber eyes glinted beyond the tree-line, visible through the station's windows. They watched me with the patience of a predator that knew its next meal was assured, that understood the pact we'd made in the dark hours after midnight. The Night Stalker had fed, and Black Hollow would slumber peacefully for another night. I secured the station door, checked the shotgun mounted on the wall, and extinguished the lights. Some rules existed for a reason, etched into the bones of places that remembered older laws than the ones written in books. And in Black Hollow, I was the reason they were kept. The mountains held their breath, anticipating the next fool to challenge the darkness. They never had to wait long. There was always another Mitch, another Ben Ruiz, another defiant teenager who thought they were stronger than the night. I was no longer Deputy Eli Carter, haunted by a shooting in Pittsburgh. I was Sheriff Carter, keeper of Black Hollow's only law, and the darkness between the trees was my jurisdiction. The badge on my chest wasn't a symbol of justice. It was a promise to the thing that lived in the shadows, a contract signed in other people's blood. Outside, the fog settled over the town like a blanket, and amber eyes watched from the tree lean with satisfaction. The Night Stalker had its keeper, and the keeper had his town. The balance was maintained, one broken rule at a time.